Invincible Season 4 is ultimately not a perfect season, but it is a good one. The big wins in this season are the Mark vs. Conquest fight, the general pacing having almost every episode be plot relevant, and Nolan's arc moving along nicely. The inclusion of Viltrum lore is generally a win, and Nolan's backstory is one of the best show original stuff since Season 1, which is saying a lot. Some major flaws looking back are the existence of a lot of filler like the Paul subplot, the Order subplot, and the Hell episode. There's also times where there isn't a totally seamless integration of the new direction of the show to the old comic original stuff, causing some discourse. I'm referring to Debbie mostly. And obviously, the animation and fight scenes, which I'm gonna do a video on later, are lacking. I'd say it's a good show still, but overall, it's not a season I'm itching to rewatch. I'll be going through this episode by episode and giving my final score at the end. Invincible Season 4 dropped its first 3 episodes today, and I am whelmed by the incremental improvement. The actual animation itself is basically the same, but it improves in having better composition and shot choices. A lot of the backgrounds are softly lit, giving them more depth, and there's more informed shading on the characters in general, which helps to give the scenes more to visually appreciate. There's also certain shots that show characters reflected in another surface, which is always a good cinematic shorthand, and there's a couple of tracking shots during the Dinosaurus and Mr. Liu fights. The effect animations, like the fire, Eve's magic, the sequids moving around, are all good, and it's kind of funny how these are consistently made at a higher frame rate than the actual character animations are. Overall, this is a pretty good improvement over the last 2 seasons. During the first episodes of those, I would be able to list the amount of shots I actually liked on like one hand. Here, it's in the double digits. It's not exactly high art like you'd see in something like Jujutsu Kaisen, which is also currently airing, but hey, that's a pretty high bar for animation in general. There's no shame in not hitting it. This season seems to be using action a lot more than the previous seasons to fill out the runtime, and it seems to be slowing down the movements of its characters to do so. If you watch the episodes, you'll probably notice that the characters take quite a while to travel across the screen. They could probably stand to improve the feel of the animation by increasing the anticipation and lowering the actual movement time to give it a weightier feeling. In terms of the actual story, it covered most of the beats I expected as a comic reader, with a couple of new ones that I'm happy about. It looks like the Mr. Liu story is going to be a proper subplot, and honestly, given that he's capable of messing with 2 Viltrumites at the same time without dying, I wouldn't be totally shocked if he ends up joining the war effort that Omni-Man and Alan are gathering. Of course, there's a problem of motivation, but we'll see. And speaking of changes from the original canon, there's a couple of elephants in the room we should probably address. Firstly, Eve's dad's speech being changed from a misogynistic tirade to him blaming Mark, and secondly, the tech jacket gender swap. Now, on Adam's speech, I'm actually a pretty big fan of the way that this scene was changed. He's still cartoonishly misogynistic, don't get me wrong, but we get to see a much more insidious form of sexism through Eve's mom internalizing the idea that this is the life and partner that she deserves. That showed me a growth and nuance in the script writing, so I consider it an improved version to the original scene, even though the original is quite funny, with Mark's reaction to the misogyny being so annoyed. And this episode was written by Helen Lay, so I'm not surprised that she decided to make this critique on misogyny a little bit more realistic. On the other hand, the tech jacket gender swap is not something I'm totally a fan of. Kirkman doesn't always have the correct approach to writing characters of a different race or gender when he makes these switches. He takes the method of writing them like he would any other character, avoiding stereotypes and pretty much making them race or gender neutral. This can lead to some incongruencies, like Debbie feeling like a white woman with basically 0 hints towards her Korean heritage, and Mark being, for all intents and purposes, white, with him looking Asian for the first time in this season. Since Tech Jacket as a character is a very bro-y guy in the comics, I hope Kirkman will make the effort to make sure that she isn't a one-to-one copy of him. Episode 2 has the most new stuff in it, with the fall of Viltrum being shown instead of told through exposition. I like the insight into Nolan's past and the Viltrumite culture at its peak. It helps justify his emotional outburst towards Thetis at the end of the episode, even though it's blatantly clear that said culture is pretty much awful in every way, and definitely did deserve to be wiped out. I mean, come on, homeless kids when we have like skyscrapers everywhere? Are you kidding me? And another thing that I find especially enjoyable about this segment is the fact that it recontextualizes the beatdown that Nolan gave Mark in season 1. This is something that he literally had to go through as a child, well, as a teen on the cusp of adulthood, and he did that to Mark. By all rights, it should have been something considered totally normal to him, and yet the fatherly love he had for Mark was so strong that he broke his own conditioning, and he was unable to do it without flying off, tears streaming from his eyes. Anyways, unfortunately, due to the limits of the animation, we don't get to see Nolan's face contort in anger to mimic J.K. Simmons' amazing delivery like we did in some season 1 scenes, but we did get some very good visuals of Viltrum itself, with the ring around the planet being, of course, the main centerpiece. It's clear that Invincible has switched to using more 3D models than it used to, just like how it did in season 1, and that's made especially clear through this sequence, because there is no way that you could have drawn this many Viltrumites in a pile without using some sort of 3D technology. And the Flaxons as well, obviously. The Flaxons, their robots, the ships, all move like 3D models rather than 2D animations. You can tell by how smooth they are. It's a better improvement over season 2, which was almost entirely 2D. Overall, I thought that the extension of the Nolan not being able to sleep at night gag was fun, and so was the Star Trek parody, but I don't feel like this segment meaningfully added much to the comics versions of events. But you know, a little bit of characterization is always welcome, so long as it's fun and engaging. In a fighting show, the fights should have some characterization, and perhaps if we'd gotten to see the differences in how Nolan, Space Racer, and Alan fight, it could have been interesting, but they all move very similarly to each other. I think if I was writing the scene, I would have included some flashbacks to how Nolan originally fought Space Racer. That way we would see a before and after, and it would show that he's grown more merciful, more heroic in his movements. It could show him being, very ruthless towards Space Racer to begin with, and now moving towards restraining rather than trying to kill him, or being more defensive. I did enjoy the expansions of the Viltrumites' cruelty throughout their Imperial reign, and I think it's important because it'll color a lot of the conflict later on. As for whether Invincible made the right choice here to kill Russ and beat up Titan, I think he did. In the comics, it wasn't as clear that the Sequids were about to breach containment, but here it was almost directly said that it had to be done with the barrier failing. That was a great addition to the scene. It really ramped up the tension, and I thought that, generally speaking, this whole sequence was done better than the comics. As for the Titan beatdown, he can handle it, and he's a mob boss. It's not like he's any sort of victim. He usurped another mob boss who came after him, and that's just crime, baby. The fact that they both ended up in the Union again after all that is the cherry on top. One thing that's sort of a minor critique, I guess you could say, for this first 3 episodes is that there seems to be a lot of action that happens simultaneously, and it doesn't fit as well as it does in the comics. The reason I'm saying that is because in the comics, there's a lot less filler scenes, so it really does feel like the world is just going to hell. There's just something happening at every point. Just imagine the show without most of the just talking sequences, and that's the comic, so it feels a lot more realistic, I suppose. Here, it feels a little bit more contrived that stuff like the Flaxon invasion and Mr. Liu's attack are happening at the same time, but honestly, that's just writing. Overall, I'm a pretty big fan of how the season is going so far. I think that there's room for the animation to improve, obviously. I do think it's a lot better than it used to be, and I do hope that it gets a lot better than it is currently. And hopefully, even though Kirkman doesn't really seem to enjoy improving the animation, hopefully the people underneath him are able to do so, and hopefully he never gets Leonardo DiCaprio to cameo as some hot dog vendor for a minute and totally blow the budget on Doechii songs and other pop music. This is the first episode that comic fans haven't been able to spoil for everyone else, and it's got a bit to unpack. Firstly, I'd like to give a shout out to the background animators for this episode because the lava and the flames look great. This is also the first time we're getting a stylized fight scene since Omni-Man on the Flaxon planet, and you can tell that not needing to worry about coloring allowed them to be a lot more expressive with their movements. From the start of the episode to the end, there's only 2 to 3 scenes that are really plot relevant. We have the beginning scene with Mark and Art, and then the scene at the end with Eve and Mark. Everything else is show original, which includes the Debbie and Paul subplot, the Egyptian mummy subplot, and of course, the Hell main plot. We start off with a cool looking fight that's very much played seriously. Volcanica and the Dark Bloods are all deadly serious about what's going on, and the speeches are long and grandiose. When Invincible arrives, he's sort of meant to be the counterbalance to this dire seriousness. After all, the demons aren't really important. They're props to a story that exists to set up the punchline for Invincible. In Japanese comedy, there's a concept called straight man and funny man. The funny man says something funny, and the straight man reacts to it in the way a normal person would, pointing out the absurdity. In this way, the audience finds humor in the contrast. In a scripted show like Invincible, comedy is often derived from someone reacting to a mundane situation in a ridiculous way, or reacting to a ridiculous situation in a mundane way. I guess my point here is that you need both elements in the scene, otherwise the scene just has no energy to it. The feeling of momentum comes from these two contrasting energies, and when Mark is so depressive and Damien is so exposition-y, it makes the whole plot feel lethargic. I think that's the big issue with these subplots. They need more contrast. Either they're completely mundane, like the Debbie and Paul buying a new house subplot, or they're completely fantastical, like the Titan and Hell subplots. The scene of Titan protecting his kid from Magnetak is cool, but it doesn't offer very much other than just being cool. It could fit into any other superhero story. These scenes aren't operating at multiple levels. The fights are purely there just to be fights. That's one thing that I wish they would change. If it's a superhero world where all of this comic book wackiness is a fact of life, I'd like to see a little bit of it in the house buying subplot. Maybe Debbie and Paul can casually discuss which areas of the US are more prone to supervillain attacks. Maybe more fantastical subplots can be grounded here and there. Invincible seems to have a bit of trouble figuring out what kind of a show it wants to be. On one hand, it's a show that seems to relish in subverting various tropes in superhero media. On the other hand, it's a show that authentically lives in a superhero universe. So while we have Mark making fun of Damien's demon nanite helmet, we also have Mark and Eve's pregnancy conversation getting interrupted by Nolan and Alan's appearance to recruit him to the Viltrumite War. And I mentioned this inherent tension that Invincible has as a superhero show because it's sort of intrinsic to the reason that I think that the Hell plot just isn't as good as it could be. I'm not trying to say that this was something that Kirkman wasn't passionate about, because he clearly was. I go over in my animation video how he was very excited for this and genuinely wanted to show it off. He's interested in explaining the origin of the Magma Mites and the kaiju that beat up Omni-Man in Season 1 and where Damien came from. He even has this cute little backstory where Damien owes Satan something and then he repays his debt by the end of the episode, so now he has to go and find whatever us humans are doing that made the villain mad. Now, do we know what that backstory is? Not really. Does Kirkman? Also probably not, considering how vaguely it's spoken of. In fact, it's actually kind of impressive how evasive this subplot is on giving any level of detail whatsoever to the actual characters involved, and not the 6 ages of the world, which are gone into at great length. As an aside, can anyone explain why Satan's crown was tossed into the pit? Damien says it's fragile, so why didn't Volcanica destroy it? I like the unique effect that Cerberus had when hitting Invincible, but the whole fight being off-screen wasn't that fun, considering that every other Invincible fight here is a stomp. Frankly, it just seems like it was made for the 2 jokes and that was it. I know it sounds like I'm being a Debbie Downer, and I really did go into this episode hoping that it would be good, but I just can't lie, Has-Been Hotel does its depiction of hell way better than this. Has-Been is spiritually Tumblr, as in it acknowledges everything about hell and purposely rejects it. Invincible's hell is more Reddit-coded, where they drain all the religious influence from it entirely, and the actual lore is not interesting enough to justify spending this much time on having Damien lecture Mark about it. The casting of Bruce Campbell was also an odd choice, because I assumed Satan was going to have bounds of charisma and energy, only to be outdone by Has-Been's Lucifer and Satan. At least his design after he gets the crown back is good. I got a lot of questions on my first video asking why I think Invincible should have more 22-minute episodes, and this episode is a good reason why. I think it definitely would have improved by being halved, and it's kind of funny, between Genshin Impact and now Invincible, I keep getting into stories that are becoming known for drawn-out dialogue. It's starting to baffle me how Season 1 was an anomaly where every change they made improved the show compared to the comics, in terms of pacing, character development, and subplots. Each season since has been following the pattern of adapting exactly the comic formula and also adding a bunch of new stuff that doesn't really mesh. And when I say new stuff, I'm not just talking about the new plot points or the new subplots, but oftentimes a lot of filler lines and scenes. Well, I'd rather not go on and on with this much negativity, so let's talk about some things I enjoyed about this episode. I think that unlike the Season 3 filler episodes, it does fit neatly into Mark's arc of learning to become comfortable with himself after crossing the line. There's a lot of calm, meditative scenes expounding upon this. Damien isn't a very strong character, so unfortunately there's not much he can do to serve as a foil, but it is what it is. I think there's at least something interesting about Kirkman deconfirming the afterlife. Now, Mark knows that there will be no divine absolution for his sins, because there will only be oblivion once he dies. In other words, he must focus on the here and now to make Earth as good as he can. Without getting into spoilers, this is something that will define the rest of Invincible. People have also been discussing the William recasting. Personally, William has been so consistently absent that I mostly forgot about him. Due to this, I didn't notice the recast. I've seen people say he was too flamboyant, and I guess I did notice that. However, I thought he was flamboyant even in the earlier seasons, so I guess I didn't notice. Once again, it is a celebrity cast. Once again, it's a guy using his own voice. I don't really think that there's much to say about this anymore, to be honest. I'm gonna continue this video with a confession, cause I know most people ain't making it this far. I'm a power scaler and a shipper, and I try not to let it impact my opinions on shows because I'm also a reading comprehender, but in this case, it's difficult. Because, on the power scaling side, can anyone explain why Invincible beats Volcanica with zero effort, but gets hurt by the Vile, who are weaker than the demons and Satan, who are weaker than Volcanica? If they just wanted Mark's outfit to get destroyed, they could have just done that instead of injuring him, and the show wouldn't have to acknowledge this. But because they had him take a real injury, I'm forced to acknowledge it. And on the shipping side, can we explain why Paul and Devi have had more scenes than Mark and Eve as a couple, doing couple things? Frankly speaking, neither of them have chemistry. Their love feels purely functional. There's no specific dynamic that you can point out, other than that they're vaguely supportive of each other. I just wish that the romance was written better. At least Mark and Amber had something, you know? You can describe their relationship at any given point. And it's not that the romance in the comics was much better, but it's still something I like to see. You can do a lot with a little after all. For a lot of other shows, I see fan arts of the main couple a lot, but for Invincible, I haven't really seen any fan arts of Mark and Eve at all. Maybe it's just me. Overall, this is definitely an episode that existed. I'm excited for what's happening next because it's the Viltrum War and other stuff like that, but I'd definitely skip this one on a rewatch. You could tell instantly from this frame that the animators locked in. The way Conquest fights look so much better than the rest of the show has to be studied. My theory is it's a freelancer named Joaquim dos Santos, who, if you scroll through his Instagram, shows that he worked on the last Mark vs. Conquest fight with the famous wavy hair. I've seen some people say it's Heong Chong, who is responsible for the Omni-Man vs. Guardians fight back in Season 1. Either way, it's clear that there was a shift starting from here, and likely this fight was done by a freelancer. This is great news! Freelancers often get more time and have more expertise in specific scenes, and they can really focus in on the scene that they're assigned to in comparison to the other animators who have to work on the other cuts. I genuinely hope that we get to see more of this kind of work later. This scene in particular is something that I'm not even sure I could show on YouTube, but wow! This is one of the first times the show has made me feel visceral emotions on the same level as the comic. One of my friends had to look away, that's how disgusted he was. I knew what was coming and I still felt that chill run down my spine. Oh my goodness, that was sick. And this fight wasn't even the only thing to talk about. Let's take it back to the beginning of the episode with that Omni-Man and Debbie scene. Well, technically we start off with Mark and Omni-Man talking together, but frankly we don't really care about that. The Debbie stuff is where it gets good. In an earlier video, I said that Steven Yeun and J.K. Simmons were the only good VAs on the cast. I'd like to amend my statement. While no one is watching specifically for Yeun, Oh, or Hamill, they're all excellent VAs here. Sandra Oh has a great performance, only mildly hampered by the animation. I wish the animation had captured even a little bit of the emotion that Sandra was putting in through the booth. There's been crazy stories from VAs, like how Yuji's VA from Jujutsu Kaisen literally laid down on a floor and cried during one of his scenes, and it shows that voice acting is really acting. It's just a shame that this is what the scene looked like, and if you want to know what it could have been, Twitter user Cesebomba, I think, did a great reanimation. This scene played out very differently in the comics. In it, Omni-Man is forgiven pretty much instantly. Of course, also in the comics, his heel turn came very early, and it also wasn't nearly as bad. He just roughed up Mark rather than going out of his way to destroy an entire city. So it made sense here that Debbie, who's now an actual character, and Omni-Man, who is way more evil than in the comics, can't reconcile. And this brings a rather gloomy air to everything surrounding him. He's used to people realizing the depth of his change by him simply apologizing, but the kind and heroic Omni-Man is all Earth has ever known, so of course, they won't be nearly as forgiving. We also know that Debbie will eventually forgive him since we get another flashback of them later in the episode, but it'll have to be more earned. This is the most radical shift that the show has from the comics. It's one that's been in place since season 1. Even though the main plot of the show seems to be chugging off at around the same pace, this is still something fresh and exciting that I'm here for.
There's still something you need to address!
And of course, now that she's actually in the episode, we have to talk about it. Y'all were out there calling people crazy when they theorized in Season 3 that Tech Jacket was a woman. Y'all were out there saying that the source was unreliable when it was brought up Episode 1. Now we have it. Tech Jacket is Zoe Thompson, not Zach Thompson. We start her off by fighting what I believe is one of the members of the Union, the Walking Dread, a reference to Kirkman's other comic. This intro is really stretched out and another example of something that I pointed out when I said that when Invincible needs filler, it adds a random fight. This did not need to be that long, and frankly, the fact that she was sort of struggling with an Earth criminal does not inspire confidence that she will be of much use to the Viltrumites later. To me, it's extremely odd that Tech Jacket gets changed into a woman and then immediately starts losing fights that he won in the comics. As we can see here, he was putting in work against the Viltrumites, but in the show, she just gets wrecked by them. I was sort of hoping that we would have more Earth heroes or villains or whatnot on the squad, but I guess they didn't want to change it too much from the comics. And after that, we finally get our first on-screen Korean meal. When I watched this episode, I was so happy. It was very close to what I had for dinner last night. Korean food, American drinks, and a Western dessert. Amazing. No notes. During this season, Mark has felt noticeably more Korean than he used to. First, we had the shower scene, then he refused to bow to Satan, which shows some level of Christianity, and now he's eating rice. None of these aspects are stereotypical, and yet they make him feel more Korean nonetheless. I had one guy tell me in my comics that I was projecting my own whiteness onto Debbie, and as a PSA, I am not white. Please do not mistake me for a white person. Thank you. Back to space, and we have a bunch of mostly boring scenes up until the ship gets intercepted by Conquest, Lucan, and a third Viltrumite who looks kinda homeless. Since the actual fight isn't much, let's just go back to the Mark vs. Conquest fight. I am of the opinion that Mark should have spent time learning BJJ or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instead of bench pressing magnets. If he did, he could have easily defeated Conquest. I'm not talking medium difficulty, I am talking low difficulty. Let's go over it. Striking martial arts are generally considered unviable for flying superhumans like Viltrumites, who are flying and don't rely on footwork, balance, or gravity. BJJ, however, does not rely on these. It is a grappling martial art that works by you applying your own pressure onto an opponent and using your force to leverage parts of their body to break. If Mark had done a rear naked choke instead of a front choke, Conquest would have had zero options. If he flies, Mark is still choking him using his own strength. The pressure is coming from his muscles and Conquest himself. If he tried breaking Mark's arms, he can't. He tried in this fight and couldn't do it, even with a better position. Spinning around or slamming Mark into the ground would both cause way less damage than the Viltrumite knife hand that he hit Mark with, and without sufficient room between them, that isn't an option. Conquest is big, but he isn't shown to be flexible. Mark would have sunk the choke in, held it for 5 minutes, and Conquest would be out, finished, kaput. Mark would have some bruises or a concussion maybe, but he wouldn't nearly have been as injured. That is my rant as a guy who did BJJ for a couple of years and achieved a blue belt. It's not much, but it's enough to understand that you could totally apply it to flying people that can generate their own leverage. If you try inverting gravity by flying, the other guy can fight back by flying downwards, and even if you float upwards, you still have access to chokes like the triangle choke, which can be performed from the bottom position. I might go into this in a full-length video maybe, but Invincible doesn't respect fighting, and by fighting I do not mean power scaling. I said before that Invincible chooses to fluff its videos out with fight scenes. The reason I say fluff out is because a lot of these fights are not really informative of the characters. There's a secret to communicating things about a character through their fighting, and with the exception of the Mark vs. Conquest fight, Invincible doesn't really care for it. The choreography is mostly just muscular action figures clashing together, again with the exception of Mark's choke. Not only that, but Conquest loses to Mark, but Mark was also losing to these flaxen robots, so how would Conquest do against those? We're led to believe that something like 5 or 6 of them could outperform him. The Reanimen as well seem to be stronger than their human counterparts, so the ones made from the alternate Mark's body should be even more powerful. Why aren't they bringing those to fight the Viltrumites? Why not bring the regular ones? Since the soldiers the Viltrumites brought along were enough to shift the tides from the main characters winning to the Viltrumites winning, then how strong are they meant to be? I'm not saying that they need to keep a detailed chart that shows off the level of power of every character, but when this entire season rests on the premise that the Viltrumites are an unstoppable force, having Mark be brutalized by literal fodders before taking out the second strongest Viltrumite in a 1v1 is not a good look. Fights don't need to be filler, but Invincible treats it like it is, and I'm sure a lot of people will say stuff like, well, it makes the story less boring, or wouldn't it be bad if Mark just one-shot all of his opponents? Firstly, go watch the Ip Man movies. He's already solved the Superman problem. Systemic issues, more powerful opponents, hostages, and just being flashy with it are all solutions to an overpowered main protagonist. Mark trying to fight systemic issues would honestly probably be better for the budget than just adding more filler fights, cause it'll be talking scenes anyways. We finish off the episode with Omni-Man and Oliver about to board for the next episode, and Alan and Tech Jacket squirreled away in the Viltrumite ship. I'm as clueless as anyone as to what'll happen with those two, since I forgot that portion of the comic. In the meantime, subscribe if you want to see me cover the Viltrumite War, and thank you for watching. We start off the episode with Thetis and Thrag giving their little speeches. It's cool. I don't really have much to say on it. They're not generational speeches, neither of them are Irwin, but we will see that Thetis' speech is better, which gives us a bit of insight as to how this episode is gonna go for these two, but that's something I'll cover later. Let's start off with the best part of the episode, Oliver and Nolan's conversation and subsequent bonding time. I don't think it's a very hot take to say that this is the best part of the episode, other than maybe that beautifully rendered explosion that takes place when Mark and Oliver punch through Thrag's ship later in the episode. Mwah! But enough about explosions, back to talking. Oliver and Nolan obviously needed this conversation, and while this was a much more muted affair in the comics, the show has changed Oliver. Before, he was a more rational type of character who spoke kind of like those Reddit atheists. Now he's more of a normal kid. I think this is generally a better approach than what the comics took, and this conversation proves it. I like that they're building off organically on the additions that they've already made, and that these new additions are meshing with the main plot rather than just adding on subplots. Oh yeah, also, what's with this albino Viltrumite? She looks cool and I don't remember her in the comics. Hopefully she shows up again. Thetis is such a boss. I love this shot of him absolutely decking the shit out of Krieg, and he in general has really gone up in my estimation over this episode. Even having read the comic before, he still manages to look better here, I think. He's really roughing it out, and that's commendable when he's been spending most of his time hidden. It'd be easy to assume he's a coward, but nope, he's the last line of defense. Thrag, on the other hand, becomes a little unforgivable. First is the infamous "No!" scream, but I'm honestly not a fan of any of his portrayal so far. I was looking forward to him, obviously, because he's an aura farmer and a real demon and whatnot, but his voice and the way he's posed aren't really doing it for me here. For me, his voice is too deep for how he looks. It's the same issue with Conquest not looking nearly rugged enough for that smoker voice. The voice is okay, it just doesn't fit him. A more regal-sounding baritone would fit the way his Thrag looks, since he already has a youthful quality, and by stretching out the Telescria battle, he sort of looks like a fake demon for not showing up. And speaking of which, one thing I want to cover in this episode specifically is the page count. This is 2 issues worth of story, which is 40 pages. 20 pages per issue, it's pretty easy to count. Now what this means for a 48-minute episode is that each page ends up being a little over a minute, not including scenes which are new like Omni-Man struggling against the bugs and the egg subplot. Yes, Mark didn't need the eggs in the comic, and Omni-Man didn't actually struggle against that bug. He just used the patented Viltrumite slash in order to get it. I think that this slow adaptation leads to what I call One Piece syndrome. It's where you take a bunch of pages and need to stretch them out into a longer episode, which means that you need to turn segments that are 1 page into 5-minute sequences, or so on and so forth. And this ends up being an issue, especially in the latter half of this episode where Thrag attacks Telescria, because doing so introduces plot issues that weren't there in the original. For instance, I saw some people wondering why Thrag didn't exit the ship and join the fight. In the show, it's many minutes between the ship coming to attack and Mark and Oliver breaking it. But in the comic, it's only 9 pages before they do. It's a lot more reasonable of a time frame, especially because they spend one of those pages worrying about the traitor, this fat McDonald eating motherfucker here. In the comic, Tech Jacket got a little crushed by Anissa, yes, but it was because she attacked him from behind and only had control for 2 pages. Meanwhile, in the show, Anissa is dragging Tech Jacket through buildings and just generally thrashing her. It gets to a point where, I sort of have to recommend the comic over the show because as I'm rereading parts of the comic that the episode goes over, I really can't stress enough on how it's better. All the things that should be making the TV adaptation go harder, the audio, the movement, the ability to direct in more interesting ways, it's not really there, and the story, which is what we're all here for,
there's still something you need to address!
Now, there's this massive thing that I'm obviously late to, but it wasn't worth a whole video on it, so I'm just gonna include it here. A storyboard revisionist who shall remain unnamed because I don't like outing people made a very poorly received video which was quickly deleted off of TikTok. Playing the original audio would be detrimental to her cause, so I'll tell you what she said instead and go over whether or not I agree. 1. She claims that the Invincible fandom is wildly sexist. This is partially true. As is the case of all nerdy, male-centric fandoms, there are going to be sexist people in it. I can't pretend that I haven't seen people like this in the fandom. I do not believe that this is reflective of the fandom as a whole, however, and there are legitimate, non-sexist reasons to be iffy on the gender swap, which I'll go over later. I'm proud of every one of my subscribers and viewers for not being sexist. Shout out to you all. 2. She claims that there are people who say that they're fine with the gender swap because Zoe is a love interest for Oliver. This might be because I am sequestering myself to the Reddit, Twitter, and YouTube side of the fandom, and I also did a brief check on Tumblr, but I have never seen this sentiment expressed. Not once. I've seen people upset because they believe that Zoe is a love interest for Oliver, but I have never seen people happy that this is the case. I'm not saying these people don't exist, but I haven't seen them across 4 platforms, and so I'm gonna assume that this is false. Claims 3 and 4 are the infamous women are autonomous beings and when writing a story your character should service the plot as a whole claims. I'll discuss those together since I can. Generally speaking, when writing a story, characters are not autonomous beings. They are props to serve the plot, not real people. This applies to both men and women. Charitably speaking, what she meant by this was women can be involved in their own plots unrelated to a man. In all of fiction, this is true, but in the case of Invincible, it's false. All of the major female characters in Invincible have been defined by their relationship to other men, often romantically. Debbie is defined by her relationship to Nolan and Mark. Eve is defined by her relationship to Rex and Mark, and now just Mark. We don't even see her alone, let alone pursuing her own interests or goals or interacting with her own friends separate from Mark's. Amber had her relationship with Mark, and after they broke up, she disappeared. Shrinking Ray was entirely a prop for Rexplode, Monster Girl to Robot/Rudy/Rex, and Kate is completely tied to the Immortal now. The only single female character is Anissa at this point in time. Being in a romantic relationship isn't a bad thing, but it is worth noting that Invincible consistently places its female characters in relationships with male characters who are more plot relevant than they are, and tossing them aside when the relationship ends. Cough cough. Shrinking Ray not showing up at Rex's funeral. Cough cough. So yeah, overall, it's not a great video, and Invincible could definitely stand to do better with its female characters. Back to our regularly scheduled programming. Anyways, I find the Tech Jacket gender swap problematic because she's done nothing but serve as a damsel in distress for these past episodes. Yeah, they allowed Space Racer, Omni-Man, Mark, Alan, and Thetis to get individual wins over Viltrumites, but she only gets wins on fodder. At that point, she's no different from any one of the millions of soldiers that these people have working for them. Tech Jacket was always the least effective of the group in the comic, but if you're gonna gender swap her, you should at least give her enough wins to make her stand on her own and not look like a liability. I also find it pretty funny how every fan art I've seen of her makes her look much better and have way more of a personality. So yeah, in the red corner, we got Thrag, Fraud of Frauds, the Fraud Regent, whatever you want to call him. In the blue corner, we have Tech Jacket, the Fraud Jacket, Fraud E. Thompson. Comment down below who you think is the biggest fraud, and thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe. To be honest, this is the first episode that I am just completely negative on. Ordinarily, the animation, which you know I talk about, wouldn't bother me that much. The show would at least provide something good story-wise. Episode 6 had lackluster fights, but the Nolan and Oliver bonding was a good storytelling addition. But here, the main thing was the reveal behind Thrag's backstory, Argall, and the Purge, and in my opinion, all of that makes Invincible worse. My issue with Thrag in this episode isn't that he's a fraud, though I have joked about that in the past. It's actually kind of the opposite. He has a lot less personality in the show than in the comic, despite getting a backstory and overall more screen time, including a heart-to-heart with Nolan. For instance, in the comic, Space Racer brings in the Ragnars, and they start wreaking havoc on the Viltrumites. Thrag immediately sees that the Ragnars are powerful and develops a counter-strategy. He says, "By the throne of Argall! They're too strong! Don't try to fight them! Avoid them! Run! Let the vastness of space be their demise!" Show Thrag's reaction? He doesn't have one. He doesn't actually fight the Ragnars at all. The Ragnars are brought in at 23 minutes. Thrag is seen at 24:42, just standing there menacingly. It's almost inconceivable for Show Thrag to acknowledge another race as superior to his own in any way, but comic Thrag was a relatively competent leader in his own right. In the comic, Thrag leads his army into battle first, rather than hanging back and waiting for his enemies to approach him. You can see him taking out Space Racer with a single punch while motivating his troops. He's an active combatant and leader. Then there's this iconic exchange. Oliver, not knowing what Thrag looks like, approaches him, saying, "Hey dickhead, a black hole called. It wants its suck back." Thrag responds by saying, "You are a funny one, I gather. Always cracking jokes. Very good. I enjoy a good joke myself. Remind me if you heard this one." BAM! And then he blams Oliver's skull open. It's darkly comedic and it oozes personality, but the stern look on his face makes it impossible to treat him as a jokey villain. Later, there's an exchange where Thrag is yelling at Mark after he blows up the planet Viltrum. He doesn't just call Viltrum his own heritage, he includes Mark in it, in a stunning act of what can almost be considered inclusion for this half-breed Viltrumite. Honestly, this moment alone added more facets to him than what I had expected. He goes from this one-dimensional Darwinist, pure evil badass to a person who genuinely feels a connection with his culture. In fact, this show has done a lot of stripping Thrag's competence and personality away. He's consistently engaging in combat with his enemies in the comic, while the show has him stand back and allow his Viltrumites to die, despite that being something which allegedly pains him so much. Sure, he's not saving his men in the comics, but he's taking out threats, which to him is probably just as good, if not better. There's a moment where Thrag uses Mark as bait to lure Omni-Man in and spear him through the guts. This moment was sort of removed in the show. I'm not sure why. It was a good moment. It's showing that Thrag is not only a good fighter, but an intelligent one, and he's willing to exploit his opponent's love for each other. You would think that a Darwinist like him would just go strength is might and take on both of them at the same time like an honorable villain, but no. He's willing to exploit that. He used his strategy to prove his point. Relying on others makes you weak. Only being alone makes you strong. As for the Purge, I won't be able to discuss that here without mentioning some spoilers for stuff that I think will be covered in seasons 5 and 6. The long and short of it is that it makes Thrag's character worse and it ruins a little bit of mystery surrounding him. And also the way it was written in the comics gave me a lot more faith in Kirkman that I probably shouldn't have after seeing what he really thought the Purge was. Okay. Moving on into the spoiler territory. In the comics, the Purge was never shown. From the way that Nolan described it in the Season 1 events, I had assumed that the version of history he gave to Mark was propaganda, that Thrag had assumed the throne violently after Argal's death and waged a combination of civil war and ideological crackdown which was then disguised in the history books as a purge to leave only the strong behind. It was the only way that I could reconcile the remaining Viltrumites being simultaneously exceedingly loyal and also not the greatest at one-to-one fighting. And it's something that was reflective of history. Oftentimes, violent purges are disguised as attempts to strengthen the country, when all they do is strengthen the iron grip of the leader. If they had gone in this direction, Thrag would have been a competent dictator. However, in the show, it's revealed that Thrag actually just killed a guy on stage for no reason, then said, "Murder's legal now," and everyone just started killing each other for no reason. It's clear that if the Viltrumites were willing to act like this, then Argal was basically the exact same as Thrag in terms of this culture that he cultivated, and the remaining Viltrumites would have no reason to prefer Argal over Thrag as they do in the comics. The two are essentially one and the same, and speaking of, we see Argal, finally, which is not something that happened in the comics, and what we see from him makes very little sense considering what we hear afterwards in the comics. Later on in the comic, we have the Viltrumites jumping Thrag, saying they didn't respect Argal's strength, they respected his wisdom. This makes zero sense because Argal is kinda stupid in the one flashback that we've seen him in. It's made clear that the strength-based hierarchy, the mindless violence, and the rampant colonialism is all him, not Thrag. Before, you could argue that Thrag had basically rewritten history to turn Argal into something he wasn't, and that the remaining Viltrumites remained loyal and accepted this out of fear, but now it's sort of impossible to say that. Oh, and here's another thing. That iconic planet-busting move from the show was canonically a really bad strategy. It pissed off Thrag, it caused him to kill Thetis, and it did not deter the Viltrumites whatsoever. In fact, it caused way more issues. If they had left Viltrum alone and just retreated, then Thrag and the Viltrumites would have clung to their delusions of restoring the Empire, allowing the Coalition to pick them off one by one as they spread too far. Since they lost Viltrum, they moved over to Earth. Sure, it ended up working out at the end, but at the time, it was a move made purely out of Thetis' spite and self-hatred towards anything Viltrum related. He gets everyone to do it in the comic, and they don't know why. So it makes zero sense that in the show, it's turned into Nolan's idea. Nolan should not care about destroying Viltrum. That's a Thetis thing. Anyways, I read the comic, and I know what happens in the next episode after this. It's nothing special, just a bunch of talking scenes for the most part. That's the end of the spoiler discussion. So if the show was gonna do something animation-wise, it was gonna do it here, and it didn't. It didn't live up to that conquest fight from earlier. It was basically 20 minutes of straight hands, and most of it didn't look great. The parts that did, once again, were the effects animations. I don't know who's doing those, but it's insane how the flames, explosions, etc. look so good, while the characters are just PNGs being dragged across the screen. There's a term that I like to use called the visual language of film. It refers to the way that, just like how sentences have grammar and syntax, visual mediums have those as well. A shot that lingers on an object begs you to pay attention to it. Filming a character from below makes them feel more imposing, or changing the lighting changes the mood of the scene. A close-up on a character's face can say different things if you're showing the eyes or the mouth. What you show is a creative choice just as much as what you don't, as well as how you show it. Invincible's direction doesn't just fail because the animation is bad, it fails because it doesn't know what not to show. There's some iconic faces from the comic. Take this one. Let's say I wanted to adapt it into the show, but I don't have any budget left because I got Tom Cruise to voice the hot dog stall man. It's okay, we can make do. I'll take these two black bars, I'll cover up some of the top and the bottom of the screen, and show only a portion of the face. They're in space, so their mouth isn't moving anyways, but it saves me the trouble of having to draw the teeth, and I can just have it be one frame anyways with some tears leaking from the eyes. Boom, simple. Are people gonna hail it as a perfect adaptation? No. However, I'd argue yes in a way that this shot from the show at the same moment doesn't. Paul Bros, we lost so bad. I honestly think it's hilarious that while Marvel fans are hating on their Paul and cheering on his death, Invincible fans were cheering on Paul and hating on his off-screen breakup. And shockingly, for once, this is the only bad thing that I have to say about this episode. That's right, everything from here on out is pure glaze because my god did they cook here. First off, we have to shout out Simon Rasiopa. I hope I'm not butchering that name. This guy's the showrunner for Invincible and also a writer, and he's written 8 Invincible episodes, including Season 1, Episode 7, which is a highlight of the show. This one is also a highlight of the show, bringing us back to Season 1 where they would mix and match various parts of the comic to create a story that flows better. This adapts issues 77, 78, and a couple of pages from 79, which contains the abortion scene. Overall, they're arranged in a much more satisfying order. By adapting more material as well as adding story that's really additive to the overall narrative, unlike the house buying Paul subplot earlier in the season, this episode stands out among the rest of the episodes of the season. In the comics, Nolan is present when Thrag negotiates with Mark, and he then leaves anyways. Super out of character, never thought about it before, but it's very good that they changed it. I also like the extended fight scene where Mark helplessly fights Thrag, which is both animated surprisingly well. Hey, is that a smear frame I see in my Invincible animation? And composited with shading that the people are loving, proving once and for all that Invincible does indeed need more than 4 people on their compositing team. The actual scene is not that different from the comic. I liked it then, I like it now. I'll just end off by saying it's good. There's another big change in the show which I'm almost a fan of, which is that Mark's delusions of Thrag killing everyone don't just go away because he made it back to Earth. They persist, and there's a couple of times in the episodes where he'll just snap into it. I like the way that they punctuate otherwise normal scenes with tension. The only thing is that I wish Conquest was there. I know it's not logical for Conquest to be here since he's, dead, but it's also not a rational fear that Mark has to begin with, so I think it would be fine if he showed up. If they had done that, it'd be perfect. No notes. I just don't necessarily buy that Mark getting his eyes squished by Thrag was more traumatic than getting his guts ripped apart by Conquest, in addition to what he did in the finale of Season 3. Also, during these scenes, Lee Pace sounds a little bit weird here, but since he sounds normal once we actually see him in real life, I'm chalking it up to be Mark's hallucinations being weird. Still, there's a lot to like about this choice, not least of which is that they've upped the goriness from the comics in some ways. Additionally, one other cool thing that they do, which honestly I wish they used a little bit more in the actual show proper instead of just these scenes, is the use of blurring in order to make the cinematography and the shot itself feel more dynamic. It doesn't have to be used in this rapid, quick cut way as it is here, but using it on certain foreground and background elements could add a certain level of depth to the shot. I also found that the scene in the beginning where they first invade in Mark's head was well animated, and that's thanks to the tireless efforts of the VFX animators who have consistently been carrying this show. If anyone has any information on whether this was a specific team or an outsourced company who's in charge of stuff like explosions, fire, and the tsunami, please reach out. I'd love to properly credit these people in my videos. Moving on to something else that's new, we have the scene between Cecil and Nolan, as well as Cecil and Mark. It shows an interesting aspect of him that's been explored throughout these seasons, which is that Cecil is not a rational person. Of the two of them, Nolan is objectively the more rational choice to deal with diplomatically, but Cecil only extends that sort of courtesy to people he trusts or people who he views as lesser than him. He tries to act as if he's rational, but in truth, he's paranoid, kind of narcissistic, and a real control freak. He only accepts help from people he views as his lessers, and he tries to keep people he can't control at arm's length. It's always been one of Invincible's strongest trope subversions, having the mastermind government figure being a very emotional person. Of course, he remains at the baseline competent enough to prevent the planet from imploding under the crushing force of the superhero world it lives in, but he's not exactly intelligent. Partially, this is due to the comics where he was a different character, less badass, more of a joke. Him letting Conquest live was part of this, and I think Mark telling him about that would have made a good addition to the scene where they speak. Since they were already willing to change a lot, I wish they added this, but I can't fault them for not doing so. I can only judge based on what's in the show and comic, not what isn't. Moving on to Debbie. We can see that the writers struggled to keep her in the same position, physically, as she was before. It's important that Mark be without his parents because he needs to grow as a person, so I can't fault them for sending her off planet. There isn't anywhere on the planet that she could reasonably be, and Mark wouldn't be able to visit her regularly or just call her. My only issue is that they broke her and Paul up, making every scene with them this season into a massive pump fake. I'm not even really a Paul Glazer like that, or a Paul bro or anything, but this ended up being a total waste of time. I swear it's like 15 or 20 minutes across these episodes that were devoted to these two developing their relationship and trying to buy a house together, only for them to get broken up off screen. I think we could have had a version of this show where she stayed with Paul, or rather stayed in a relationship with Paul and still went on the trip, and then broke up anyways later due to some other natural reason. I don't know. Like I said, that's my only issue with the show. Oh, and also, it is very, very clear to me that Debbie and Nolan are getting back together, and if you think this is a character assassination, then you'd best brace for it. You Debbie lovers are not going to make it past season 5, so get your theories, fanfictions, and copiums out of the way. Finally, of course, we have to talk about Eve. She's fat now in the show, or rather, I should say curvy, because she did not look like how she looks in the comics. I have zero stake in this argument whatsoever, but I will say that I have seen both some very funny memes and some very entertaining discourse surrounding the topic. Whatever you think of it, they very clearly decided to not make her too unattractive in the show, and unfortunately, it just seems a little bit cringe to me because this willing to go there is one of the things that made the comic Invincible special. A quick aside, but if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I plan on making one more Invincible video, maybe two, and then moving on to The Boys. Let's talk about that abortion plot. Obviously, a touchy subject now. It was a touchy subject back when it was made in the mid-2000s, and it probably will remain a touchy subject for a while. I think Kirkman probably extended Mark's coma time to 10 months because he wanted to further justify Eve's decision to the audience more than if it had been 2 to 3 months. It's left sort of ambiguous when exactly she decided to get an abortion, and that's probably the point. To me, it's sort of toothless, but this decision was made in episode 6, not episode 8, and I don't really have a big issue with it. In the comic, this conversation was brought on by Mark and Eve going over to see Caden Immortal. I don't like this pairing, I never have, it makes very little sense to me, and I fail to see how the two of them were able to stand each other, but considering they're both very annoying, perhaps it was meant to be. Either way, this decision got those two out of the picture, and I am very glad for that, I guess. No spoilers, but the part of the comic that we'll be covering in Season 5 will be uniquely fitting for the limitations of the show. I believe that Seasons 5 and 6 will likely be the best in the show, with the sole exception of Season 1, of course, but they will almost certainly be better than the past 3, and I am so excited to see where it's going next. In total, I'd give Invincible a solid 6 out of 10 in my heart. Stripping the comic reader bias away from my brain, I'm more inclined to rate it a 7. Have a nice day, y'all.